This is currently being recorded in 2021, but it's scheduled to go out in 2022. So when you're watching this, you will be a year ahead of me right now. Well, not a year ahead, a few days technically, but in a different year to me right now. And I hope you rung in the new year with plenty of festivities around loved ones, and you had a great time. A few of you will be watching this right now quite dusty, a bit hungover, but if you've chosen to watch this, then maybe you're still drunk. But yeah, it's Oliver from Rugby League in my opinion here, and we're bringing in the new year with a Rugby League World Cup themed video. Why? Well, in 2022, we are officially in a World Cup year. Supposed to be in a World Cup year in 2021, COVID had other plans. So now the 2021 Rugby League World Cup will be taking place in 2022. But we're not going to be looking towards that World Cup in this video. Oh no. We're going to be looking at every other World Cup that there has already been, and we're going to be ranking them from worst to last. But before we get into the rankings, we have a few Rugby League World Cup stats. There have been 15 official Rugby League World Cups, with the first tournament taking place in 1954. It was actually French Rugby League's governing body who put forth the idea of a Rugby League World Cup. To that point, the only major World Cup that there was in sport was indeed the FIFA World Cup. The Rugby World Cup actually hadn't launched at that point. So Rugby League had their first World Cup a bit before Rugby Union. And that was pretty much down to the French, which might seem funny as they're not. Well, they're still a great rugby league nation with a heartland in the south of France, but obviously their influence on rugby league is nowhere near as big. So to the modern day fans, that may seem a bit odd, but yeah, today we have a World Cup and the way it is today, and we have the French to thank for it. So there you go. There have been a total of 3 winners: Australia, Great Britain, and New Zealand. I was thinking of saying Great Britain, England, but I don't think England actually ever won a World Cup. I think it was whilst they were Great Britain. We've had 8 host nations. Australia and England have always been the major hosts of the tournament for many years now. France have hosted 2 tournaments standalone, but other countries such as New Zealand, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Papua New Guinea have also hosted Rugby League World Cup games, and a total of 87 stadiums across the world have hosted a Rugby League World Cup match. It is also important to note that the Rugby League World Cup has really taken on 3 different formats. One format is the format that we know today, simply the group stage, knockout stage, and then the final. But it has also been decided by whoever has finished atop the ladder in certain tournaments, and also has been determined over a number of years, with 2 World Cups in particular not taking place in a single year or in a single host nation, but over a 3 to 4 year period. Crazy to think about today, but it's happened twice. And I guess as well, you could also say in the early years where there were only 4 teams, it wasn't quite the traditional setup that we know today, but it was the very early stagings of that. I guess you could say a group stage, which had all 4 teams, and then the grand final. Essentially, that's all they could do because there were 4 teams. But other than that, let's get into the rankings, kicking things off with the worst Rugby League World Cup of all time, number 15. In number 15, it's the 1957 Rugby League World Cup. And believe it or not, shock and horror, many of these World Cups I was not around to see, and for a few of them, there is no real footage of them. So I'm basically going off of what I've seen in terms of the tournament and how it was set up. The reason I've got Australia winning on points in 1957 as number 15 is purely because Australia won on points. As I said about a minute ago, that one of the formats of the tournament was whoever finished atop a ladder at the end of the World Cup took out the prize. I'm not a big fan of that. I think for a World Cup on a world stage, in all sports, you see continental finals, you see world finals, everything, it's always decided in a final. I think crucial. So Australia winning on points in 1957, as in the amount of points they accumulated by winning each game. So 2 points, then 4, obviously, so on and so forth. Finishing first on the ladder, I don't think that should be just cause to crown you champions of the world, especially in a 4-team tournament. So 1957, unfortunately, has the honour of being the worst Rugby League World Cup. On to number 14 now, which is the next World Cup, the 1960 World Cup. Again, it's very low because it was the exact same format. However, and this is a mistake that I made before that I am now correcting. I don't go back and edit it. I let it be known that I made a mistake. In 1960, England won the World Cup on points. Just like Australia, not much more to say. The only reason it's ahead is because Australia have won that many World Cups. In this day and age, it's a bit of a boring thing. So for another team to have won it, it is a bit more exciting, if you will, I guess you could say, looking back in hindsight. Back then it wouldn't have been, but today, looking back in hindsight, so it just gets the nod at number 14. Not quite the worst, but basically is just a different winner of the tournament in a stupid format. Coming in next at 13th, we have the 1970 Rugby League World Cup. Australia beating Great Britain 12-7. Now, why is this one so low? Well, there had been a few years of the Rugby League World Cup by that point. A few instalments between 1954 and 1970. Basically, every year it was 4 teams: Australia, Great Britain/England, New Zealand, and France competing in the tournament. Basically, every year it was Australia versus Great Britain/England in the final. By this point, it seems a bit repetitive, and that shows when the organisers of the World Cup would go on to add more teams and try new things out with having the tournament over multiple years instead of just the one contained tournament. And I guess this selection is really honing in, I'd say, on the fact that 4 teams in a world tournament just doesn't really sit right, to be honest. And the honour of displaying that and being an example of that is the 1970 Rugby League World Cup. In 12th, we have the 1968 Rugby League World Cup. Australia would defeat France 20 points to 2. Now, this one, again, it's sort of another example of just another 4-team Rugby League World Cup with the same 4 teams in the tournament. What saves it from being below 1970? Well, France were in the final. It was the second Rugby League World Cup final that France would appear in. You'll hear about the first soon. And to this day, it is the last that they have been in. So a bit unfortunate there for the creators of the Rugby League World Cup, or the pioneers of it, if you will, especially losing 20-2 in this final here. But yeah, it comes in at 12th just because, France were in the final. So something a little bit different there, I guess you could say, in this 4-team tournament with the same 4 teams for about 15 years. On to 1972 now in 11th place. And to be honest, this one probably could have been lower than 12th and maybe even 13th place. But I've got it here just because it was something different. To be honest, the 1970 Rugby League World Cup. The 1972 Rugby League World Cup. I literally made that mistake whilst looking at the list I've got here. I'm having an absolute stinker. However, 1972, Great Britain wins the Rugby League World Cup by drawing with Australia in the final, and that's why it finds itself a fair bit of the way down this list. I'll be honest, because it's not Australia winning, it also gives it a few points. I'm Australian. I know this sounds weird, giving sort of points to these World Cups if Australia didn't win. But it's just become so consistent, Australia winning these World Cups, that when something different happens, it does get some brownie points, if you will. But the reason why it's so low, well, Great Britain won the World Cup in the end due to the same reason that teams won the World Cup in 57 and 1960, and that was by finishing atop the pile, I guess you could say, from the group stage, finishing first. But there was a final in this tournament. They versed Australia. They drew. No extra time at all, which I know there wasn't a thing back then. No replay of the final or anything. Great Britain literally won the World Cup by drawing in the final with Australia. And in a world tournament to crown the world champions of a sport. In no way, shape or form should that victor be crowned champions of the world by drawing a final. It just should not happen. Moving on to number 10 now, which is 1975. However, I am going to address another mistake I made earlier in the video. That's right, I don't edit these out as I say. I address them later on. And it's a mistake that I made when I thought I'd fix the other mistake. Put it this way. Of course, originally I said that only Australia, Great Britain, and New Zealand have ever won the World Cup, right? And then I said, for 1960, that it was actually England, because here I've got England written down, so I thought it said England. I went back to where I did my research, and it turned out it was Great Britain in 1960. Shock and horror, I know. I am disgraceful for making that mistake. But 1975, Australia defeats England. Now I can confirm this one was England because I went and double checked. Australia beats England 25-0. Why does this one come in 10th? Australia just flogged a team to win the World Cup. Well, this is where we see the first little bit of change in this tournament. I've been complaining that it was only 4 teams. We got 5 teams in this tournament, folks. After literally 20 years of the exact same 4 teams in the Rugby League World Cup tournament, we finally added a 5th. And there's a reason why Great Britain went to England, because the 5th team was Wales. So there you go. Just adding that little bit more to the tournament because there was an extra team added. And that's essentially why it finds itself so high. Not really that high, but why it beats out the other 5 Rugby League World Cup tournaments that we've spoken about so far. 9th now, and it is the 1977 Rugby League World Cup. Now, why does this one come in 9th? Well, first of all, Australia defeats Great Britain 13-12 in the Rugby League World Cup final. And to be honest, that's what really gets it its place. This was the closest Rugby League World Cup final that we'd had to date, other than that one that Great Britain and Australia drew. But I hate that one because Great Britain should never have been crowned champions based off of a draw. So the closest we've had where a team actually won, where we actually got a result and crowned a champion. Australia winning 13 points to 12 at the Sydney Cricket Ground on this day. What probably keeps it maybe from being a little higher is that they beat Great Britain, which means Wales definitely wasn't in this tournament, and unfortunately there was no one replacing them. We went back to your standard 4: Australia, Great Britain, New Zealand, and France. Number 8 now, and it is the first of our 2 multi-year Rugby League World Cup tournaments. It's the 1989 to 1992 Rugby League World Cup, which in the end was decided in a final between Australia and Great Britain, in which Australia won 10 points to 6. Close game as well, which I give points to as well. I can't say I'm the biggest fan of this initiative. I can't say that I ever want to see it return, but I get it. To try and be different to the World Cups of the time in other sports, Rugby League was trying this new initiative where the World Cup would be over a number of years. And I get the thinking behind it, because if you are going to be the best in the world, you're going to be the best for a prolonged period. In this instance, 3 years, 4 seasons. So I get it. I get it. And that's why it's sort of middle range here. Why is this one not above the 1985 to 88 Rugby League World Cup? Well, you're about to find out. So at number 7, shock and horror based off of what I literally just said. It's the 1985 to 1988 Rugby League World Cup. Same setup as the previous installment, although this one came first, which is a contributing reason as to why 85 to 88 is above 89 to 92. This was the first one, so this is where that initiative first came into play. Australia beating New Zealand 25 to 12 in the final. Now notice something here. What's the one thing I haven't said so far in this video? New Zealand in the final. That is honestly the biggest reason, I guess, this one comes in at number 7 and in front of its successor, if you will, in this weird multi-year format. It was the first time New Zealand made a Rugby League World Cup final, so it was historic in that sense. And in hindsight, with, I'd say, the international powerhouse New Zealand has gone on to become, this was sort of the first inkling of it. This is where it really began in the 1985 to 88 Rugby League World Cup tournament. So in a way, historic when you're looking at it in hindsight like we are today. So that's what gets it 7th. New Zealand in the 1985 to 88 Rugby League World Cup would play in their first World Cup final. Top 6 time, and this is where I sort of make this divide now. These next 6 entries, I'd say, are World Cups that I genuinely like. I know that's a weird thing to say, but the rest of them that I've seen, I've had sort of head-scratching moments. But for these World Cups, there were steps in the right direction, to put it that way. More positives in a way than negatives. So let's kick it off with number 6. 1995, Australia beating England in the final, 16 to 8. Why is this one so close to the finish in a way? Why is this one in the good side of that border that I've just made? Well, this World Cup featured 10 teams. Shock and horror. For the first time, we didn't have a 4 or 5 team tournament. We actually had something that resembled a world tournament with 10 teams. Sure, most teams got flogged, but it gave these teams the opportunity to verse world-class talent and to build on that. And it set the foundation for now, what I would say heading into the 2021 World Cup in 2022, a solid lineup of teams where multiple teams are feasibly a chance of winning the tournament. And I'm talking about 4 or 5 teams here. And that platform was laid in 1995, and we've got to respect it. So the 1995 Rugby League World Cup coming in at 6th. At number 5, the 1954 Rugby League World Cup. You want to talk about pioneering and taking steps in the right direction? The first ever Rugby League World Cup is bound to do that. Historic and sort of fitting in a way, because as I said before, the French were the first to put forth the idea of a Rugby League World Cup. The first tournament was hosted in France. I wish I could say France won, but they did make the final, losing to Great Britain 16 to 12. What else is historic about this? Well, when New Zealand made their first final in the 85 to 88 tournament, I asked you guys, what hadn't you heard to that point? What was something you were hearing for the first time? Well, what's something you're not hearing for the first time here? I'll give you a second. You probably worked it out already. Australia were not in this Rugby League World Cup final. To this point, this is the only Rugby League World Cup final that Australia has not appeared in. They finished 3rd, New Zealand finished 4th, the Classic 4 in the first tournament, of course. But it's also historic in hindsight for that reason, not only for being the first Rugby League World Cup, not only for the pioneers of the tournament, France, making the final for the first time, first of 2, but also in hindsight, the fact that Australia didn't make a Rugby League World Cup final once is baffling and I guess historic in its own way until the next time they don't make a final, which, if things keep building like they do, not necessarily in 2021, but in the relatively near future, They could miss another one with other teams growing, but in number 5, 1954. In number 4, 2013. Positives for this tournament, well, one of them is a 14-team tournament. That means an expanded group to what we've seen thus far. We had emerging nations such as the USA go as far as the quarterfinal, and they faced Australia in said quarterfinal. I've given it a shameless plug so many times, but I love this interview that I did last year with USA international Christian Freed, who actually played in that game against Australia and went in depth into the experience of the day, the game itself, and versing Australia, and just the immense talent of the players he was going up against. I highly recommend you go back through the archives on YouTube. It was about August 2020, I think it was. It's titled Christian Freed Interview, but I'm going to use this as an excuse to plug it because he's a great bloke, he's one of my good friends, and I loved that interview, especially that part of it. But 2013, Australia defeats New Zealand in the final 34 points to 2. What's the negative in this though? Why is it 4th, not 3rd, not 2nd, not 1st? Well, in the modern age, there has never been a more convincing time where Australia is just going to walk a World Cup, or that they're so far above everyone else that they're the most dominant team in the world. Sure, Australia's made all but one Rugby League World Cup final. They've won most of them, so there's always been that dominance. But this was sort of the revival of it after a certain installment of the World Cup that we'll get to soon, where they had a bit of a dip. But it was sort of the re-emergence of that dominance. There was really no questioning that Australia was going to win this World Cup easily, and they did so against, genuinely at the time, the second best team in the world, and the only team with any hope of beating them whatsoever. They flogged them. And again, I'm an Australian. I should be supporting Australia, but when you're that dominant, and when one team is so clearly going to win the tournament and they just walk the tournament, it's not that memorable or entertaining. So the 2013 Rugby League World Cup is where it is because the expanded tournament to 14 teams, I like that. Teams such as the USA, emerging nations, making the knockout stages, but Australia walking the tournament minuses its brownie points here and doesn't see it make the top 3. It is time for the top 3. Kicking things off in the top 3 and 3rd, the 2000 Rugby League World Cup, Australia defeats New Zealand in the final 40 points to 12, and you're probably thinking, hang on, wasn't your whole argument for the 2013 Rugby World Cup not making the top 3 due to the fact that Australia flogged a team in the final and walked the tournament? Yes, but 2000 had something different, and something I guess more important for the progression of international rugby league and this tournament in itself. For the first time ever, and to this point, the record number of teams in a Rugby League World Cup tournament. In the year 2000, there were 16 teams in the Rugby League World Cup. Most teams got flogged. Easily. But, again, like 1995, took that next step forward, and it gave those other emerging nations experience to build on and become better for it. It was crucial in that sense. And we have since gone on, ever since, to have 14-team Rugby League World Cups. And overall, you compare the teams getting flogged in 2000, many of them now are at least having somewhat competitive games with the better nations. In fact, a couple of them have beaten certain nations on occasion. Tonga beating Australia in 2019, one of the most historic moments in professional rugby league history. Again, in second place now, the 2008 Rugby League World Cup. Historic for one big reason, and we know that reason. Well, unfortunately, one of the reasons why this World Cup isn't first, which I don't think, if this wasn't the case, this World Cup would be first regardless, but we regress back to 10 teams just for that 1 year in 2008. not a big fan. But we still did see some emerging nations make their Rugby League World Cup debut. The USA, for example, and New Zealand won their first ever Rugby League World Cup. And to this point, their only Rugby League World Cup, defeating Australia 34 points to 20. An historic moment, an historic game, an historic Rugby League World Cup. And yes, the huge reason as to why this finishes second is because it was the first time New Zealand had won a Rugby League World Cup and cemented themselves as a powerhouse of international rugby league and a genuine rival and genuine combatant of this Australian dynasty. It's never a sure thing that Australia is going to win when they go up against New Zealand in rugby league competitions, whether a Four Nations, whether an Anzac Test, whether a Rugby League World Cup. It seems to this point Australia's bogey team, if there ever has been one, is New Zealand. And it's not just by chance, it's because they are a great national team. And again, that was cemented in 2008. Well, we've nearly been here for, only half an hour. Finally, number one. And there's only one Rugby League World Cup left to pick from, and it's the most recent Rugby League World Cup. The 2017 Rugby League World Cup. What a fun tournament and a fun ride to go on. One of the reasons why? Well, because of what was implemented, of course, originally in 1954, built upon in 1995 with the 10-team tournament, built upon in 2000 with the 16-team tournament. We had a relatively competitive Rugby League World Cup where at a very big stretch, 5 teams could have won. In hindsight, 5 teams could have won. One of them was Australia, who did win the tournament. The other was England, the runners-up. New Zealand, who were reigning runners-up and champions the tournament before. The other was Tonga, who had that meteoric rise, if you will. And the other was Fiji, who had one of the most underrated and one of the biggest upsets in professional rugby league history during the tournament. Australia, of course, winning the final 6-0 against England. In the modern age of a Rugby League World Cup, this is the best World Cup final. Hands down. Arguably ever, but in the modern age at the very least, it's the best. Australia up 6-0, doing everything they can to keep the English onslaught out. An England side that was largely made up of Super League players as well, which is interesting to see. Unfortunately, I do think England have taken a back step since 2017. I don't think they will be as competitive in the 2021 Rugby League World Cup. But in this game, wow, they hung in there, they gave it their all, but the Australian defence just hung in there. Smith, Slater, Cronk, on and on and on. There are other players you can name who are now no longer playing our game. This was their last Rugby League World Cup. And for those 3 players in particular, I believe, it was their last game for Australia. Cameron Smith, the champion he is, lifting up the Rugby League World Cup trophy for the last time, and his last time wearing Australian colours, in a gutsy effort against England. Images after the game of the likes of James Graham, shattered, gave it his all, left everything out there. In the modern era, at least since the early 2000s, the only team that's ever come close, as I said, to being a competitor to Australia, that proved themselves a genuine competitor to Australia, was New Zealand. Out of nowhere in this Rugby League World Cup tournament, England proved they were there too. As I said, unfortunately, I think they've taken that step back, but wow. I'm 3 minutes into this segment. We're over half an hour now, and I'm not even finished with my reasons why this is the best Rugby League World Cup of all time. Fiji beating New Zealand, the huge upset in that quarter-final. everyone was expecting, if there's an upset coming from somewhere, Tonga will beat one of England, New Zealand or Australia. That semi-final where Tonga, on the bell, had the game ripped away from them. They were this close to a Rugby League World Cup final for the first time ever. England just holding on. Just holding on in one of, in my opinion, the greatest professional rugby league games of all time. England versus Tonga. Semi-final of the Rugby League World Cup. Do yourself a favour. Watch that amazing game back, because it is honestly so good. And if you're a lover of the underdog, who were Tonga in this one, just that heartbreak at the end. Watching it back, I was supporting Tonga in this game. You still feel that heartbreak, really. What could have been, or what could still be to come in future years. They're not too much weaker than they were, Tonga. If not, they've built a little bit more. But it was just the fact that realistically those 5 teams could win the Rugby League World Cup. At a stretch even, there were more than 2 teams who could have won the World Cup. And that's what was exciting about it. And what I'm glad to say is in 2021, or in 2022, the 2021 installment of the tournament, I feel like it's even more competitive. We're set for an even closer World Cup. And I'll get into that right now. So we've now finished the rankings, but as I said, I'm going to get into the 2021 World Cup now. As we look towards the not too distant future of the Rugby League World Cup, well, in 2021, I genuinely think there are 5 at a stretch, 6 teams who could win this tournament. Australia, and this is the order from most likely to least likely to win, in my opinion, out of these contenders. Australia, New Zealand, Samoa, Tonga, England, and if you add in a 6th, I'd say Fiji, just because they've surprised a few teams in the past 3 Rugby League World Cups by making 3 straight semi-finals. You can't tell me they're not looking at 4 in a row. And they've still got the NRL talent as well. Australia and New Zealand cannot face in the final like the 2017 Rugby League World Cup. Let's be honest, they'll most likely verse in the semi. I think we are looking at, on paper, if things go the way I think they will, on paper, the best New Zealand side we've ever seen go to a World Cup. And of course, let's not forget, they've won a World Cup before. So I'm saying this team is better than that one. Australia is Australia, of course. Samoa are going to have a few Penrith Panthers premiership winners in their team who hadn't even made their debut or were sort of unknowns at the time of the 2017 World Cup. They're going to be led by the likes of To'o and Jerome Loai, who's officially a Samoan Rugby League ambassador, so he's not going anywhere. They're going to be a real threat. I think the semi-final, of course, Australia and New Zealand, one side of the bracket. Whoever wins that probably wins the World Cup. But on the other side, it's going to be Samoa versus either Tonga or England. And at the moment, laugh at me if you want, I take Samoa over both of those teams. That's the exciting thing too. And you know what? On their day, Tonga have proved it. If Australia's a bit off going into a game, that passion and that drive and that effort can beat Australia if they're a bit off. If they're a bit off in this Rugby League World Cup final, it is feasible that a Samoa or Tonga could beat them and win their first Rugby League World Cup final. I'm really excited for this next installment of the Rugby League World Cup. And then we look to 2025. It was supposed to be in the USA and Canada, which I think would have been great if there was more build to it and more work done to build the game in the USA. Nate Gladden from the Rugby League in America podcast can tell you more about that. But instead of just going, okay, we'll have 2025 back in Australia, because it's gone Australia, England. Sure, there have been other host nations, but they're still the main ones. At the moment, all the mail is, and Wayne Bennett, of all people, is publicly pushing for the 2025 Rugby League World Cup to come back home. Now, you instantly know the place I'm talking about if you've got to this point in the video. France to solely host the 2025 Rugby League World Cup. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm all for it. It's still a Rugby League heartland, even if it has moved down south. There are some beautiful stadiums in France too that I'd love to see games of professional rugby league played at. The Parc de France, or is it the Parc de Prince? Sorry if I botched that pronunciation. Also the Orange Velodrome in Marseille. All these other stadiums, I'm keen to see rugby league's biggest stage showcased on these grounds. With Trent Robinson returning to the French governing body, not returning to, but being appointed to, he's returning to France in some capacity, former coach of the Catalan Dragons, but returning to France in some capacity. Wayne Bennett publicly backing France's bid to host the 2025 Rugby League World Cup. I think it's going to happen. And if you're going to go to any Rugby League World Cup in your lifetime, try and get to 2025. There's exciting things coming up in the world of international rugby league with, on paper, the closest Rugby League World Cup we've had to date in 2021 or 22, and the World Cup returning home in 2025. I can't wait. Thank you if you stuck with me for this long. Let me know in the comments, are you looking forward to the World Cup this year? And who do you think will win the tournament? Other than that, I've been Oliver from Rugby League in My Opinion. Please subscribe, please like, please comment, share this around with your friends. I'll see you next